Hello, this is Patrick with Royce, and welcome back to episode 3 of our networking series. Today we'll be talking about RPCs, but I also wanted to cover a little bit of theory just to help you along a little bit before we jump into the RPC stuff. So here is a basic diagram of our client-server model. As you can see, we've got the server in the center here, and it's connected to the clients. Oftentimes, you'll actually also have the server connected to a database. So my fantastic writing. Our database like that, so the clients don't connect to the database directly. They have to go through the server. That way they can't write anything to the database, which would be bad because then they could just say anything to the database. They could delete, they could do all these crazy things. You only want ever the server connected to the database. That is the first thing I want to cover right here. I've seen a few times where some people didn't have that, and I understand why, but this is just something you never want the clients to have access to. Okay, let's talk about the next thing, the common flow of how online games work. So basically, usually the server operates the entire game locally, and it kind of basically runs it single player. It only receives inputs from the clients. So the clients will just send inputs like if you were receiving inputs from a controller, but that's about it. That's all it gets from the clients. Everything else, it runs on the server like it was a single player game, basically. It then sends the updates to the clients. So sometimes there's a few different methods of this. There's sending state, so you can send the entire game state to the clients on every network tick. So everything that's happened, it just sends it to the clients and they show what's happened, and everything that's changed gets updated. That's not a great system if you want to say hide certain things, or say you've got a big MMO where it's like, do you want every player getting the sync data positions of all the players across the entire world at all the time? No, that's a lot of data, and you don't want to share everyone's inventories with each other and stuff like that. So you can also do targeted updates and stuff like that. But core concept I want you to know here is the server always has authority. The clients can change anything on their end. They could lie, they could do all this stuff. Doesn't matter. All they're sending is inputs to the server. They are just basically a controller. And this makes it so cheating is so much harder, rather than a player being able to say, well, I have $10 million, and the server just going, oh, I guess you do, or I killed this big boss and you're level 2. You don't want to have that cheating possibility even open to the players for them to lie, because the clients can lie for cheating purposes, or they can just be wrong about stuff. Things happen over the connection to the server, because there can be 30, 40, 100 milliseconds between the client's connection and the server. Things can change in that time, and so sometimes the clients get things wrong. So you always want to have the ground truth be the server, and then the clients just sending inputs. Clients can own objects. So like in GTA, if you're driving a car, you can own a car, and then you can change ownership of that car to somebody else if they're driving it, and they have specific control, because you don't obviously want all the players to be able to control all the cars at the same time. And if you're racing somebody, someone is able to hit your brakes or hit your gas as you're going into a turn or something like that. But still, there's just authority and ownership. Those are the two biggest concepts here. All right, now let's dive into how RPCs work. Okay, it's time to show you how to make an RPC. So to make an RPC, you go at RPC, and then you will have these options: any peer, authority, call local, call remote, reliable, unreliable, and unreliable ordered. Any peer and authority are grouped together in one set. Call local and call remote are grouped into another set. Reliable, unreliable, and unreliable ordered are the third set. So you can pass these sets into the RPC function in any order. So let's do the authority first. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to do call local, like that. And then below this, you can do any function you want, basically. So just a regular function. So func on RPC. Just going to call this RPC, and just like that. And then I'm going to just print I got called. Okay, so this on peer connected only gets called on the server when the client connects. So let's call this RPC from here. So I'm going to get our function name, so RPC underscore RPC, just like a regular function. Then to call an RPC, you have to go dot RPC or RPC ID, and then send this to, or just if you have any arguments, pass them in here as well, but we're good here. So I've set this to authority, so I'm going to call call it on the client and the server, and you'll see that it only calls from the server and not the client. Okay, let's go and run this. Okay, I got called 3 times and a debug saying it's not allowed. So why is that? So when we called the RPC on the server, it called this function here on the server and the client, so it got twice there. And the client tries to call this, and so it calls it on the client, and then it gets to the server and says, whoa, you don't have authority, you can't call this function. And so it stops it. So it only gets called 3 times. It gets called on the client because it thinks it has authority, and then it gets called on the server and the client from the server. Now we can actually see who called this function. So we can go %s, then %, and then we can go multiplayer dot remote get remote sender ID. So this is a function we can call that it'll tell us the ID of the player that called this RPC. This can only be called from within an RPC function. Otherwise, it's not going to work properly. So if you want to like pass it to another function, you're going to have to send it as an argument and not call this. This can only be called from within an RPC. So let's run this again and see. And there we go. I got called on this number. I got called by 1 and I got called by 1. See, this got called on both, and then this one only on the client. So if we do any peer, it's going to let anybody call this function. Anybody can call this RP. See, I don't really need to explain that more. I think you can change the authority of an object, but 99.99999% of the time, that's a bad idea. I would never really do that. We can change ownership and stuff, and I'm going to show you how to do that down the road, but I would never change authority. Authority, in my mind, should always be with the server. So now let's do this call remote. Okay, let's run this, and it only gets called once. So why is that? So when you call remote, that means that you can, the function doesn't get called on your local machine. So if you call an RPC, it's not going to be called on your local machine. It's going to be called only on the external machines, which is nice for things that you don't want to handle locally. So say you want to request a spawn object. You may want to do that call remote since you only want to call that on the server and not your local machine, because why? You can't approve a spawn. Now let's go into the last category of reliable, unreliable, and unreliable order. I can't really show this too well. Well, I could, but like I'm not going to pull up a thing to manage network latency and stuff like that right now. But so basically reliable, as long as the server has an internet connection and the client has an internet connection, that RPC will make it there. It's going to take longer and it's going to run heavier, but it will make it there. Unreliable, it can show up in any order. Packets could get dropped. It may not get there. Who knows? If you have a bad internet connection, you're going to miss some stuff. And unreliable ordered, it can still be dropped, but it'll show up in the right order. So reliable, you're typically going to want to use with something that has to happen. So like for networking logic, spawning objects, you're going to want to use reliable, because if it spawns for some people and not for others, that's going to be weird. That's going to mess things up. Unreliable, you can usually use for inputs, since speed is the most important thing with inputs, so you want to use unreliable. Unreliable ordered has a little more overhead, but if something has to happen in the correct order, that's the one you use. Okay, and now if you're eagle-eyed viewers, you may have noticed this transfer channel over here is set to 0. So what is this transfer channel? This transfer channel, you can have multiple channels in your network connection, and if you overload a single transfer channel, it can slow down your game. So oftentimes you'll have like your player inputs and stuff on 0, your chat on 1, and maybe your like core game logic like spawning and despawning and managing ownership and stuff like that on 2. You can break it up that way, and that way you get a broader ability. Like it spreads out the channels that your stuff's on, so a single channel doesn't get too noisy, and that can help with performance if your game. All right, I hope you understood the RPC. Oh wait, I forgot to send RPC ID. Whoops. So let's change this to any peer and change this to call local, and I'm going to get rid of this on the server, and on the client I am going to send this by RPC ID, and I'm going to send it to the server, so the server's always going to be 1. So let's run this, and notice how it only gets called once, even though I have called local on it. I only have call local here. That's because I'm sending it to a targeted player. This is super useful if you only want to send something to the server. Like say you want to request picking up a rare item. You may not want everyone to be able to see that you're you're asking to pick up a rare item. So you would only send that to the server, stuff like that. Or you can use this for proximities and stuff like that too. All right, I hope this made sense and it helped you understand RPCs and what authority and call local and all that meant. Now we can actually get into creating our network objects and managing ownership in the next couple videos. All right, stay tuned for that. Thanks.